Okay, thank you all so much for coming to this CHDH seminar. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we're meeting on today. It's the country of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm very fortunate I grew up on this land in the Dandenongs and I live and work here, and it's a wonderful pleasure to be here today with you all, and also to introduce Tom, who is an old friend of mine. So Tom and I met on the comedy scene as comedians, which Tom was just having a chat with some of you before about the trials and tribulations. So to give you a bit of background about Tom, he did an undergrad in science and the arts, and then did postgrad in science communication. So when I met Tom, he was doing comedy shows, one on human anatomy, which was called Meat Bags, and one on animal reproduction, which was called Love Factually. He's also taken part in sci-fi debates and Laboratory, which are both science communication comedy events. He was part of a podcast called Not Good Enough, which was about Australian politics and the environment.
It kind of speaks for itself.
Yeah. He spent 2 months on a ship on board outreach as an onboard outreach officer for an international ocean discovery program. So yeah, 2 months at sea. He's published board games including Village Pillage and Dracula's Feast, most notable, and works in science communication and education design for Museums Victoria and for CERES Environment Park. And finally, his latest project was working on a mega game, which Tom had to explain to me what that is, but it's a very, very big tabletop game for about 100 people or something.
Yeah, I'll explain it.
Yeah. That was about climate change, and it was for the Powerhouse Museum, the educational tool for schools. So I won't steal Tom's thunder anymore. I will pass on over to Tom Lane.
Thank you. All right, g'day. So yeah, thank you for the introduction, Elizabeth. I'm going to be speaking pretty broadly about a lot of stuff I've done. I'm not an academic, I'm not a researcher. So I'm a little bit like, none of this is referenced, you know, I don't have footnotes. A lot of it is just what I reckon. This is based on my experience largely in teaching, designing board games, things like that. So yeah, my background, like Elizabeth said, mostly my day job has been science communication. This is largely for places like the museum, where I'm doing a lot of live talks, coming up with programs, coming up with workshops, things like that. On the side, game design. Some of this is commercial, some of this I've overlapped with my educational things, and then the stand-up comedy and sort of speaking things. These are often, you know, seen as quite different fields. The overlap here, partly they're all kind of entertaining. They're all for a public audience. They're all sort of communication. But what I think the interesting overlap here is that they're all about getting people to have an experience. Creating a sort of, think about it a little bit like Inception kind of thing. You're getting people to go along with and learn and have quite a complicated experience. If you're a comedian, I'm not saying I'm a particularly good comedian, but good comedians will kind of weave a bit of a story. They'll take you on a little bit of a journey. They'll take you somewhere you maybe didn't realize they were taking you until the end. They do a little magic trick and loop it back, make you have a little experience inside your brain. With a game, you're teaching a complicated set of rules. It's kind of like designing a computer program for people who are just there to have a good time. Writing a board game rulebook is a little bit like programming a computer that gets bored, doesn't pay attention, skips ahead, makes assumptions. You've got to be making it fun. You've got to be making it meaningful the whole time. So the reason that I like to combine the games and the education is people learn through play. This is not a particularly contentious statement. Play is how people learn. It's a super effective way of learning. We see this a lot with kids, but adults learn through play as well. We model things, we simulate things, we kind of play out scenarios, and it's, you know, cats do the same thing. Don't know why I chose cats specifically, but animals of all sorts learn through play. I don't know about fish, but who knows? Someone who's studied play in fish, please let me know. This is widely understood, but I think people often can take this and use it unwisely. They go, okay, games are effective at teaching. we can just, chuck a game on anything and it'll make it effective. I see this a lot, no shade on some council in New Zealand who designed this to teach kids about recycling and waste, but I hate to see this for several reasons. And again, no shade, but I think a lot of people think people learn while playing. But they don't, they learn from playing. You can't use games as a spoonful of sugar to help your educational message go down, because games are such powerful teaching tools that it's like using a very strong medicine to help a weak medicine go down. The game is going to overpower anything else you're doing here. And yeah, so the thing you learn while playing is the thing you do while playing. You can't see that at the bottom. It just says the thing you learn is the thing you do. You're going to learn a lot by playing this game and just by looking at it. It's one of these games where you roll your dice and move your mice, you hit a space and you go back to the start, or you draw a card or whatnot. You're going to learn a lot of things here. You're going to learn basic maths, probability, taking turns, reading and following instructions, winning and losing, all of this great stuff. But you were trying to teach about recycling, that hasn't happened because the thing they're doing doesn't match the thing you want them to learn. You could make a good game about prioritizing the routes of garbage trucks, or figuring out how to use your budget to get people to reduce waste. You'd end up with an entirely different game, but it might be effective. Games aren't good, I think, for teaching just anything. There are some things that they're better or worse at teaching. I think that trying to use games to teach like facts is not what they're great at. There are some games that do that. Carmen Sandiego is a classic example of teaching sort of like a whole lot of interesting facts and trivia. But I think games thrive at teaching systems, which is amazing because systems are something that are notoriously hard to teach. I'm not going to tell you guys what a system is, but a game is a system. It's a set of rules. It's all sorts of little agents working together in unpredictable ways. I guess I just did try to tell you what systems are. But games simulate systems fantastically, and that means they can teach systems fantastically. Diplomacy is an absolute classic. Now, I don't actually know who I'm talking to. Who here plays board games very much? Oh, tons. Fantastic. That's great. Has anyone here played diplomacy? Is anyone familiar with diplomacy? Yeah, a couple people. This is basically very, very simple mechanically. You've got a whole bunch of countries. Each one can hold like one army. And on your turn, you choose, you write down your little secret orders. I want this army to go here. I want this army to support this army. The entire game, though, is played between the people, because you can't win just with your little group of armies. You've got to get your buddy in Sweden to back up your army here. And the game is diplomacy. And the thing you're doing is diplomacy. The thing you're learning is diplomacy. You're learning your friends are backstabbers. You're learning this person will turn on you. You're learning you can trust this person, and you're learning how to convince other people that they can trust you, or when to backstab somebody else. Stock market is a classic thing. I don't actually know if this is a good stock market game, but it's called Stock Market, so I thought it made for a good photo. There's a lot of games about the stock market. It goes without saying. The stock market is a game, basically. But the thing you're playing with here is, pump and dump, price go up, make profit, all that. Food chain magnate, the game about running fast food restaurants. What you learn playing that game quite quickly is it's not about the quality of your food, it's about the quality of your advertising. It's about convincing the public they want a thing that only you can provide, and then selling that a little lower than everybody else so they go out of business. Evolution, has anyone played Evolution? Fantastic game, very playable, very fun. This is a game where you start off as a bunch of herbivores around a food reserve. You start competing over that food reserve, growing longer necks, getting fat deposits, finding a way to get more food. And suddenly that food reserve gets a bit diminished. You've got too many herbivores competing, someone becomes a carnivore. Now they're just eating the herbivores. It's easy, the herbivores start to get spikes and shells, and you get this very realistic kind of arms race. And sometimes it goes too far. Some people might say this is high frontier, a game of orbital mechanics. planning where your rockets are going to go through the Lagrange points using fuel to go to Mars. This is not for everybody. If you online, it's called High Frontier. Look it up. There is a whole series. There's expansions. I've only played basic High Frontier, which is this. It goes up from here. Now, some people might say, okay, at this point, get a computer. And they're not wrong, maybe. There are a lot of limitations in tabletop games. You've got to be using discrete numbers. You've got to be doing things that the human brain can handle. But there's an advantage to that as well. If you want to be, planning an extremely complicated system, simulating lots of fiddly numbers, yes, use a computer. It'll handle all that stuff. The beauty of physical games, tabletop games, is that every single computation, every single action has to go through a human mind and a human hand. And that means you understand everything that's happening on that board. By the end of a game of High Frontier, yes, you'll be just stuffed, but you will understand what has happened. You will have processed it. When you play a video game, you can put a little kid in front of Civilization 7 and you can click some buttons, he can make some things happen. He might not understand what he's done. It's a black box. And this is the classic with computer games. You can mash some buttons, stuff happens. The computer does the work. It's learning. You might not be learning that much. So a bit of history. I'll go through this pretty quickly because, games have been used throughout history because you're simulating a system. And if your simulation, if your model is good enough, you can learn something from a game you designed that you didn't realize was there. So in the 19th century, Prussia invented the Kriegsspiel, which is just German for war game. A very getting away from the abstractions of things like chess, trying to replicate accurately the size and speed of various military units across different terrain, huge amounts of rules, an umpire, tables to show how many horsemen you'd have to lose before the army scattered, things like this. It helped them win wars because if you can play out a battle scenario with a board game and the other guy isn't, you've got a real edge on them. It's facilitated imagination. This is still used today in an almost identical form. And it is the same as Warhammer or something. It's the same. It's just that these guys have got lasers. But otherwise, they're attempting to simulate reality as close as they can before things get too obnoxious. You go further, you're using computers. Has anybody seen War Games 1983? Yeah, classic. Basically a documentary. Seriously, the way that countries handled their international military aggression, their nuclear policy was based on their simulations of games. The field of nuclear war was played entirely in the political and mental space. And people didn't know going in, okay, what if we do, fire a nuke at Russia first? Maybe they'll be too scared. Maybe they won't fire back. Someone else is like, no, we've got to wait for them to fire. Okay. A whole lot of different arguments, different modes of thinking on what we should do there. You can't test that in real life. That's insane. They played simulation after simulation after simulation and ended up finding that the only winning move is not to play. That this was not a war that could be won conventionally. And a lot of people had to change their minds. This changed the policies, ended up with the sort of systems of nuclear disarmament rather than sort of strong arming. Thanks, games. Very useful. So let's look at an example from my life, because I'm not designing war games, although that's the only way to make money, is working for the military. I don't make a lot of money. I work for education providers. So one of the first times that I found myself using games to teach was at CERES in Brunswick. If anyone's been there, it's a sustainability environment education center. I was trying to put together something for a program that was like a broad overview of sort of ecological thinking, big picture, don't destroy the environment. We need that to live. This is for like upper primary, just to sort of start that discussion happening. There was a pre-existing activity which I drew inspiration from, and it kind of used the model of stacking these big like tin cans to represent sort of human industries that we're putting on the earth. And the higher you stack them, the more unstable the stack gets. And the metaphor there is, you can't keep doing this. Eventually, it's kind of going to collapse. So that's the message. But the actual game, if you're good at this, you can keep stacking them until you've stacked them all. It's quite satisfying to do so. And your average 12-year-old can stack cans like an absolute pro. And so we've got a clash between our message, which says, don't do this, you can't do this, and our mechanics, which say, yeah, this will be fine if you're careful. This is a concept called ludonarrative dissonance. This is my favorite word. If you haven't heard it before, learn it now. Deploy it as much as possible. Makes you seem very smart. This just means that your game mechanics and your game story clash. And this pops up quite a bit in games like the garbage truck game. Why are your garbage trucks moving a random amount of spaces? Doesn't really make sense. Ludonarrative dissonance. So I took that as a bit of inspiration. I changed it up a bit. I made it so that human industry, represented by something, is on top of a whole lot of blocks representing the ecosystem. Instead of adding human industries, we're removing from the ecosystem. You can do that for a while. It's going to get harder and harder and harder. You can't do it forever. At some point, it's going to catastrophically collapse. So instead of a metaphor of building, it's a metaphor of extracting. And I found that after a few iterations, this actually worked quite well. And what you'll see here is it effectively ends up looking like Jenga. It's effectively Jenga with more metaphors attached. It's a very broad analogy. I'm not aiming to send any statistical messages here. It's more like a metaphor we can explore. But what I found was that discussions started to come out of this that I hadn't anticipated that lined up really well with the systems we were talking about. So some of them are obvious. The kids earlier in the game had a very easy time of things. They're like, okay, you draw a little card. It says you've got to remove a plant or an atmosphere because you're deploying some kind of big industry. Kids earlier in the game, great, I'll take this plant. I'll take that plant. Easy, no worries. But they're making life a little bit harder for the people further down the line. Towards the end of the game, if you've got to find a forest that you can remove without ruining things for everybody, you've really got to act quite carefully. And even then, you might be in trouble. You start to remove some of the redundant support in the ecosystem so you can have the entire thing resting on a single species of insect. Again, the metaphor becomes pretty blatant. One of my favorite things that would happen, which was something I had not at all planned for when I designed this, is that in any given grade 6 class, there's going to be a loose cannon or two. You're going to get around most of the kids pretty sensitive. Right, you can see where this is going. Most of the kids are wanting to keep things working, or wanting to keep this all functional, despite me telling them to pull things out. You're going to get to the point where there's a block where it's like, okay, we shouldn't touch that block. That's going to be a bad idea. And this kid's like, no, I reckon I can though. I reckon I can do it. This is going to be pretty great. You'll all think I'm pretty cool. And you pause the game and you go, okay, he wants to pull out this block. Do we think this is a good idea? Everyone else is like, no, don't. Okay, what are the risks here? Okay, obviously the whole thing's going to collapse. You're going to ruin it for everybody. I'm going to let him make that decision though. I'm gendering this kid, but it's almost always a little male. Tiny Elon Musk. So you let them do it, the whole thing collapses and you go, right, now, this is why we're using a model. It's just cardboard, it's fine, it's wood. What can we do to prevent that? And your average group of grade 6s don't come in with a super strong concept of, collective action, community, all of these things. They often come in with this quite individualistic, Captain Planet, we all just need to recycle, we all just need to do our part. That doesn't work here. the metaphor doesn't allow that. You say, what do we need to do? Oh, well, we've got to make sure we don't pull out that block. Okay, he knew that. We all told him that. Well, we've got to make sure they know the right thing to do. Well, he did know the right thing to do. He did the wrong thing anyway. What do we do about that? Well, maybe we could be more careful. Okay, that doesn't work. He was being careful. It didn't work. What do we do? And eventually you realize that the only thing to do is to change the rules of the game, install some regulations, make it so you're not allowed to pull out that block. I don't know how, what regulations you put in place here, but you get to the metaphor of environmental protection, national parks, things like that. And you've had a discussion about a complicated system that you've now been a part of. And if you just tell kids, oh, some people will do the wrong thing, you've got to have regulations, it's easy to dismiss that until you've actually been through the system and you've done that, you've felt the impacts in just a tiny little wooden way, but you can really make those connections. Which brings us to Monopoly. Who knows the history of Monopoly? Okay, good. Only a few people. The history of Monopoly is fantastic because you probably know Monopoly as a game that sucks to play, which it is. Monopoly is a bad game, and I'm not going to enter a discussion there. It's just the truth. As a game designer, I hate Monopoly. As a game player, I hate Monopoly. As an educator, I love Monopoly. Monopoly was invented as an education tool. This is the interesting thing about it. It was invented by this woman, Elizabeth Magie, who was early 1900s. She was an educator, an inventor, a socialist, like all around, really cool person. She invented this game to give people a bad time, to make people see that this system of free market real estate speculation sucks and ruins everything for everybody except one player who's going to have a great time. And if you've played Monopoly, which I'm sure you'll have, I'm sure you will agree, she was effective at that. The game sucks. Everyone has a bad time. It goes way too long. Everyone wants to quit and play something different, except for one person who's winning. Now, when she invented this game, and this was, I think, one of the very earliest available sketches of Monopoly. You'll see it's almost identical to the existing one we have today. But there are a few differences which make some things very clear. Does anybody know why you get money for passing Go? It's not made clear in Monopoly. Here it is. It's because you labored. You did work at your job to make money that you'll now invest. It says labor upon Mother Earth. Does anybody know why you go to jail in Monopoly? It's because you're trespassing on private property. It's not free parking, it's a public park. It's public space that anyone is allowed to exist without spending money. All of the parts of Monopoly make sense when you realize it was built for a reason. It was built to educate. Now, she built this for educational purposes, didn't try to make much money of it. It kind of got passed around and copied through universities, by academics, by hobbyists, and eventually ended up in the hands of a guy called Charles Darrow, who said, I made this, and he sold it, sold the patent and made a ton of money. And Parker Brothers just never acknowledged Elizabeth Magie's existence. It's a very interesting story. I'm not going to go into it too much right now. The interesting thing is that it didn't stop there, because Monopoly over there, still very solid metaphor. Your real estate, moguls. The metaphor breaks down a little bit when you're running the Australian postal system. Why are we buying and selling and charging rent for post offices? Why are we going to jail for... It doesn't work. If you're Harry Potter, now you might have forgotten the part of the movie where they bought and sold the Gryffindor common room or went to jail. Like, it doesn't make any sense. And I think this is really, really tragic, not just because it's a bad game and because people end up playing this, but because it perverts the entire purpose of Monopoly. Monopoly was built to show people the rules, to say, okay, look at this thing you're a part of. Doesn't this suck? If only there was a better way. The original set of Monopoly had an alternative set of rules, which was socialist, where there was, because it was kind of lost a little bit, there was sort of a bit of a welfare system. You'd win collectively if the poorest person ended up with more than they started with, that kind of thing. That was lost. They threw it out. They made it all capitalist. And then they put Harry Potter on top of it. And what happens there is now this very intricately designed real estate simulation has become backgrounded. It's become such a neutral background layer that you ignore it. You take it for granted. You say, this is something that can be reskinned as anything. This could be Star Wars. This could be Harry Potter. This could be Lord of the Rings. This could be bass fishing, which is a thing, bass fishing Monopoly. Real estate speculation is such an ignorable part of life that just take it for granted. It's the opposite of what we wanted. We wanted people to see it, to think about it, to not take it for granted. So yeah, that's my ultimate case of ludonarrative dissonance. And it makes me really sad, but I love to rant about Monopoly. I should be keeping better track of time. How are we going here? Ah, great. Oh, awesome. So let's go back to more broad game design. There is a famous saying, games are a series of interesting decisions. This was Sid Meier, 1989. You'll know him as the inventor of Civilization, very well-respected game designer. This is mostly brought up for in game design circles, but is useful for anybody thinking about games or about decisions. And this isn't talking about generally, darts or Call of Duty. This is talking about the games and I like to talk about tabletop games where you're making decisions. He also said gameplay is a psychological experience, which is extremely broad, which means it always sounds smart. Pretty much any interesting decision-making exercise or thought experiment or psychological study can be made into a pretty good board game. This is my theory. The trolley problem you'll all be aware of. There are a lot of games which effectively do the trolley problem. This is the ultimate decision-making thought exercise. You're weighing up two things in various ways. And in this game specifically, you draw cards and you're like, but what if this track had a kitten on it, but also a bad person, or now which decision will you make? When we make decisions like these, and they've got to be interesting decisions. They can't be trivial. It can't be, do you want 5 cars or 1 car? It's a trivial decision. They can't be meaningless. They've got to be decisions without an easy, clear answer, but a decision in which the answer is still important to you. I forget where I started with that sentence. But yeah, this is just a pretty simple example about that. When you make these decisions, it tells you a little bit about yourself as well that you might not have been aware of. And with psychological thought experiments, that is the purpose of it. With a game, that's also kind of fun. It can tell you a bit about yourself. It can tell you a little bit about who you're playing with. It can tell you a little bit about the system you're exploring. What are the things we find meaningful? If I make this decision that I felt was the right decision and it turns out to have been the wrong decision, what do I now understand about making those decisions in future? How can I influence the decisions other people are making? The marshmallow experiment, that famous experiment about delayed gratification, the board game genre of engine building games is built entirely around this concept. This is a game where you're racing for victory, but to get to victory, to get those points, you've got to build a little engine. You've got to collect some good cards that you can draw that will get you the points. On your turn, do you spend your time building your engine to travel faster, or do you spend your time getting a small amount of points? In Dominion, from the very start of the game, you can buy those 1-point cards. And if you're really fast at buying them, you can end that game pretty fast, and your little crappy pile of 1-point cards might win you the game. Or you can spend your turn getting gold, and then getting more gold, and then getting some fancy cards, and then buying some 6-point cards. You won't get your first 6-point card until halfway through the game, but then you can get a lot of them. You might beat out that person who filled up their hand with crappy little 1-point cards. Dominion is a beautiful game. The Prisoner's Dilemma, this is the little game I invented. Village Pillage. I'll talk a bit more about this later, but again, this is that concept of what do I want? What do they want? What do I think they want? What do I think they think that I want? Always fun. And of course, the famous Mafia or werewolf games. These were actually invented by a psychology researcher, a Russian called, no, I've forgotten his name, David something. I should have written it down there. And this is, of course, the game of who do I trust and who do I convince, how do I convince people they can trust me when no one has complete information? These are all very fun games. I haven't played Trial by Trolley, but I think it speaks for itself. So let's talk about Village Pillage very quickly. This is a little game that I didn't solely invent, but was one of the two developers of. What we started with here was we want a game where people are making a decision without knowing what everyone else is doing. They've got a very clear set of very large sort of options. You know, do I do something aggressive? Do I do something defensive? Do I do something industrious? With the understanding that everyone else is making those same decisions. It's prisoner's dilemma. Everyone has a farmer who can get a bunch of turnips. Turnips are the currency for the, just for fun. Everyone has a raider who can steal turnips. This is the fundamental of the game. If we both play farmers, we both make some turnips. If we both play raiders, nobody makes any turnips. If you play a farmer and I play a raider, I steal your turnips and then some. There's not much game there, so you've also got a wall to be defensive, to punish those raiders, and then once you've got a pile of turnips, to win, you've got to turn them into relics. So you've got a merchant who spends your turnips. You win once you've got 3 relics. This is the core of the game. And everything after that was just tweaking, was just balancing. You're playing this in a circle, so you're simultaneously prisoner's dilemmaing against the 2 people next to you. And from there, it's very interesting to see how people play. Some people start off generous, then they get mean. Some people start off mean, then they get generous once they've been punished too much for being mean. Some people try to rush to the end. Some people try to build up a giant insurmountable pile of turnips very defensively until then they can spend them all at once. There's all sorts of little decisions happening there. And this is a game that you can play with actually quite small kids. You know, if they can read a 5-letter word, they can give it a good crack. And then you can teach them very early on when to be suspicious of your neighbors and things like that. I always feel uncomfortable. I feel like I'm promoting my game, but it's also quite hard to get, so I'm not too worried. So yeah, this is also, yeah, I call this light engine building. You're kind of building up some better cards to get to the end, but you can win with just your starting cards. And this is also a race style game. Some games have a fixed ending, so you're going to play for 10 turns and then whoever has the most turnips at the end wins. This is a race style game, which means it's the first to the end. You can try to get there in 3 turns. You can take as many turns as you want if you slow everybody else down as well. People compare this to rock, paper, scissors, including myself. The big difference here, rock, paper, scissors is not an interesting decision. Rock, paper, scissors, they're the same. They're arbitrary. You're just picking one almost at random. Whereas prisoner's dilemma, aggressive, defensive, that is a more interesting decision. All right, let's talk quickly about, as another example, this mega game style game. This was a thing the pitch from the Powerhouse is they needed something that could run in a classroom for 30 kids for a couple of hours about heat waves in Western Sydney. They've got this whole curriculum module and they wanted a sort of introductory activity. And the pitch was by actually a PhD student upstairs, Nellie Seal, who works for, what department is it? Faculty of Engineering and IT. That's where game studies has fallen. Game studies is always somewhere very interesting. She runs a group called Melbourne Mega Games. If anyone's interested in mega games, look them up. Very, very interesting. They're the only group that puts them on because a mega game is a nightmare to put on. For those of you who don't know, which hopefully is most of you, a mega game is kind of like you get 100 people in a town hall for 8 hours and model UN meets diplomacy meets a little bit of war stuff. The important aspects of a mega game, it is very heavily facilitated. It's mostly interpersonal stuff. Like there is some board gamey elements, but you can spend the whole day just bargaining and negotiating and making friends and making stuff up. A little bit of role-playing stuff, very light. No one's, you know, I'm Lord so-and-so. It's played pretty straight. But importantly, there are often multiple spheres. You've got a group off here being military commanders. You've got a group over there being stockbrokers, and they're playing different games, but they connect. They impact each other. They don't know what each other are doing. They just go, we need more tanks. I don't know what that means, but we need them. Make it happen. So we took aspects of this for our little game. The problem was we do not have tons of facilitation in a classroom. They're going to have a couple of teachers. They're not going to have that high level of player freedom allowed by having a lot of facilitation. So we've got to have strong board game elements where the game runs itself. And they're not going to play all day. They're only going to play for a couple of hours. And in your average year 10 class, you're going to have a couple of people who are up with the concepts of a board game, but you cannot rely on it. So a lot of challenges there, a lot of design constraints. So, yes. Very good question. Thank you. I skipped over that. It's kind of more of a storytelling exercise. It's a bit like, now I don't do a lot of tabletop RPGs, surprisingly, but if you've played anything like Dungeons and Dragons or other storytelling games, it's not really about you win, you lose, you beat the guy. It's about what stories we made along the way. And at the end of a mega game, you always have a little bit of a wrap up, a storytelling thing. There was a bit in this game earlier where Germany managed to make an alliance with France and form a new country, Franceny. That actually happened in a game. They pushed their tables together and wrote themselves a new name. And that was a cool thing. Those guys had, I don't know if they did as well as any other countries. It doesn't matter. They had a moment there where they were like, we impacted some stuff. It was a fun moment. And that was what we borrowed for ours as well. We had a game about being councils in Western Sydney, dealing with the effects of climate change, dealing with heat waves specifically. There's no win in that scenario. There are losers, and you don't want to tackle them in the game, but the wins are you've survived kind of thing. So you've got to make a game that looks at the spectrum of how well have you done, what have you managed to accomplish, what have you not managed to accomplish, because the themes of that are climate change is not a thing we're going to win like a board game. It's a thing we're going to be able to do better at or worse at. You're always going to have losses, and you have to be able to discuss that. What are the things we've lost? Okay, what are the things we've managed to hold on to? Why did we lose them? How can we avoid losing more of them? That's a whole other talk. And so our game had some spheres. This was the council sphere. Just kind of smashed everything in here. But effectively, they're playing a little bit of a, if you've played Pandemic or a game like that, they've got crises popping up. They're rolling some dice every turn to see how their heat waves affect the little populations in their board. And they're trying to spend their budget to build protections for these little people on their board. They're buying those things from the research team. They're off on the other side of the room with some little tables playing a kind of Yahtzee-style dice game up in their ivory tower. We tried to give them something that was, something that was a bit interesting, where they could have a sense of success, and they knew their goals were to make research that people needed and to sell it off to the things. And hopefully that would help someone out there somewhere, but they didn't see the end results of what they did. Unless they chose to actually go over and wander over to that table or have a good chat. And then the third major sphere was the government sphere, who controlled all the budget in the game and made big decisions that affected a lot of people, but had kind of their own agenda. Government players wanted the councils to be largely happy. They wanted them all to have good approval. They didn't care really how that happened. It could be from keeping people safe. It could be from advertising. But each government minister also wanted specifically to push a lot of their kind of projects. The urban planning minister wanted a lot of urban planning to happen, whether or not that was particularly useful to the councils. And so the mega game thing is the interactions between these teams. They don't really know what each other are doing. They don't have time to find out what each other are doing. They've just got to try and figure out what's important to the other team, how to work with that to get what's important to them. Largely, these teams are all working together, but there are conflicts within that, which are really interesting. And so that the eventual outcome of all this, the thing you do is the thing you learn, is the thing you're doing here is trying to understand in a system where everyone's largely on the same page, why still things don't always go the way you think they should. How to sometimes help them go further towards the way they should. You can get a little crazy. You can form a union with the other councils. You can, kick up a fuss against the research teams and tell them we're not going to buy any of this garbage research you keep putting out. You've got to research this other stuff that we need. That's all off running in schools right now. I'm really hoping it goes well, and we'll hear back about that pretty soon. So I've just talked a lot about all sorts of things. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Yes. Where do you, mega games? Yeah, very good question. Absolutely. So yeah, so playtesting is super essential. Actually, I'm not going to rewind too much. Playtesting is super essential and very difficult because you've got to get a group of representative players. And you as a designer, you'll design some things in your head. But a game is a complex system. You've got to play it out to see how it works. And so every playtester, I mean, every game designer goes, I've designed the perfect game. Probably don't even need to playtest this. It probably will work fine. And the playtest, and they go, oh no, it's a mess. Everyone's totally missed this thing I was trying to do. So yeah, getting hold of school students to playtest, quite tricky, obviously. You've got to find a class. I mean, with these, I was always working with schools. So we'd say, hey, school that's coming in for an excursion, we've got this new activity. Would you like to test it out with a lot of facilitation? It'll be a fun thing. We've got it to a pretty good point. But and then we'd make sure to get lots of feedback from them. It never runs as smoothly as a good game, as a finished game, but people will often be quite up for play testing. Before you even get to that point, obviously, you run it past colleagues, you make sure that it kind of makes sense. You play it in smaller groups with the audience that isn't quite your audience. But yeah, it's an iterative process. And then you play test with a bigger group and a more representative group until you can run the entire thing for the first time with your full group properly, and then you're still noticing little things you need to tweak. With a mega game, damn near impossible to fully play test. Mega games, I think, they run like theater. So you can rehearse a show, a lot, but you never, especially like with a comedy show, the only way to test comedy is to do it in front of an audience. And you see, even the best comedians will do a show in front of an audience and it won't go well. And there was no way to know before they tested it because they thought their jokes were great. And they just go, okay, we've got to change that. They might be able to change a bit on the fly, but it's all an iterative process. Whereas a published board game, like you put it in a box and you buy in a shop, I like to think of that more like film. You've got a thing you send out, anyone can open that box and watch that movie. Those need a lot more play testing because there's a much higher stake in terms of printing 10,000 copies. Some mega games will only run once or twice, ever, because it's 100 people in a room. It's a production, it's theater. Yeah, thank you. Great question. Any other questions about anything? We talked about education, decisions, systems, monopoly. What else have I got here in my background notes? Yeah, I think I covered most of it. Oh, an interesting thing, I kind of covered the tactility of board games, but and you'll be aware of this. Video games it's easy to go more and more towards realism, in graphics, and even board games will say you've got this big fancy, model that you've painted up to look like a dragon. Often that's not necessary. I mean, we all know that, a game of chess can be incredibly dramatic. A game of cards can be incredibly dramatic, even though, the King of Hearts doesn't really look like anyone and you don't really care what happens to him. Humans can connect to a cube. If you've given them a reason to care about that cube, like I've had silly little card games where my hands have been shaking because I'm like, oh no, what if they figure out my cunning plan for this cube? And yeah, so the tactility of a board game, being able to see all of those little things and being able to connect to them, I think is really important. But I'm sure a video game designer would tell you that board games are trash. Question?
I guess this is kind of two things connected
Yeah.
together. But like when you teach using systems like this,
Mhm.
like how do you sort of avoid or consider the fact that people might like learn the way you've represented the system, and that sort of reinforces the status quo of that system?
Very, very good point.
And then making people sort of introspect and go like, why?
Something I meant to talk about and totally forgot, so I'm glad you brought it up. When you design a system to teach people or to research, you've got to be very, very careful about any biases you put in there. And it's the same with like the military systems. It's any kind of model is not reality. You're always making assumptions. And there have been military wargaming exercises where they've made some assumptions that were wrong. They've gone, oh, but of course, you know, we must have done something wrong. This fleet of speedboats could never take down this aircraft carrier. And then they've gone off into real life and had their aircraft carriers taken down by fleets of speedboats. And you'll see the same thing, and I see the same thing with educational games and board games. They've made assumptions. They've gone, oh, you know, saving the environment must be about how much you recycle. So we'll give you a point for every time you recycle, and you get enough points and you've saved the environment. You've assumed that recycling will save the environment, but you know, and it's the same with our climate game there. We've made some big picture assumptions. We've said government gives out all the budget to everybody, because we haven't really simulated all of the different channels that the budget gets into the local council. We've probably messed up some things. Some kids will go out there going, the number one thing is you've got to be able to convince government to give you all the budget and someone else none of the budget. And that's not how it works. I don't know if I have a good answer to that beyond the same thing that comes up with any sort of research or teaching, which is to talk widely, make sure you've got a lot of people on your team who can give you those insights. You know everything about your subject before you try to teach someone else, because you'll probably get something wrong. You can never get there. You can just try a bit better. And every time I make a game or teach a thing, I'm always like, if only I'd known this thing beforehand, I wouldn't have sent someone off with some bad information. I don't know if that's totally answers your question, but it's a very valid thing. Yeah. Yeah.
Information space, and there's a few games in that area.
Did you say misinformation? Yeah, yeah.
About you, they're fun to play. They have an effect for a little while, and then people merely forget about it.
Yeah.
Do you have any tips for actually keeping it salient? Or
yeah, I'm not sure I do. I think it's like a lot of education. How do you teach someone something that they'll retain, that they won't forget again? How do we even teach ourselves lessons that we won't forget again? I think all you can do is reinforce it. And if people are living in an atmosphere of misinformation, one little game might not change their mind, or maybe it will sow the seed that they remember later on. Yeah.
So what I find is that people can get better at spotting false information, and then they share it anyway.
Yeah. Because they go, look at this false information. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, oh, this is how I get lots of likes on social media.
Yeah. Yeah. Because what you're playing in there is a much, much larger game that someone else has a lot more control over the rules than you. I don't know. And it's the same thing with when I'm teaching about environment. I think a certain amount of it is making clear that any of these specific things aren't the answer. And the answer is, I don't know, something really big top down, you know, somehow find a government that does better. It's not very helpful. But no, I unfortunately don't have the answer to that. Because people keep trying, you know, we keep trying to teach things and help people correct misinformation. We haven't found the silver bullet yet. But what we can do is just buy and play less Monopoly. Yes.
A really great talk.
Thank you.
Fascinating. In the cognitive science of learning literature, there's a lot of work, probably somewhat related to Pierce's comment on transfer of learning.
Okay.
And one of the things that can be a little discouraging in some cases is people can develop a really strong mastery of a particular problem, but just can't generalize it to situations. I'm not super familiar with this literature. I think there are certain conditions in which it can be highly generalizable. There are some cases where it's surprisingly not. There's work on this in math problems as well, how like applied math problems and abstract ones don't necessarily share, people don't seem to transfer that knowledge. I'm just curious if you've thought about that at all with some of these games. Like, do people even transfer some of their knowledge from some games to other games that are kind of relevant?
Yeah, and that's interesting because games are at some level like very abstract, and people use the term, it's gamey to mean, meaningless and abstract. And when you break a game often down to it's like you refine out all of the theme and all the cards, and you bring it down to the pure math or the pure decision making. That's when you can make the like mechanical genre distinctions of this is an engine building game. And if I'm very good at playing an engine builder game, I could probably apply those skills to other engine building games, but I'm applying them at the mechanical level, probably not the like thematic world understanding level. It's a very interesting thing to think about. And I guess one way that I've tried to address this in education things is you've got to make sure that you're doing a layer on top of that abstract bit. For instance, with the Jenga style game, at its core, it's Jenga. If you try to master that, you're mastering Jenga. You're not mastering understanding the ecosystem. So the key part of that is that bit you have on top, the discussions between the turns, okay, let's think about this metaphor and apply it and discuss it. It really all I've found comes back to talking about it. Then, of course, you're relying on having a good teacher who can be able to take those strands of discussions and correct those misconceptions and help kids to sort of understand the thing you're talking about. So yeah, I don't know if I would trust an education system that purely relies on playing games out of the box, because I think you do need to make the connections to the real world a bit more. Does that answer your question a little bit? Yeah. Thank you. No, it's good question. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about games, I was thinking about like like there are two things that are kind of important just in my mind as like a psychologist, right? The first one is that you want some level of control about the decisions people make, and unfortunately you don't want emergent behavior.
Hang on, so you want levels of control as a designer?
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so you want to know the types of decisions people make. Second one is that you want to know that the game worked.
Yeah.
And I guess I was wondering how when you're evaluating kind of how people make those like decisions, do you test it on your colleagues and then that's what you're figuring out for that? And then when you're looking at how they work, are you kind of saying, at the end of some of these games with kids, you can't really figure out, like, are you going to employ collective action in future to stop?
What's the impact of your game at the end?
There are other examples of games that I guess where the decisions are less in the future and less abstract that you've done.
So you're talking, hang on, the decisions that you're making in the game or the decisions that the game is encouraging you to make in real life?
Kind of wondering if we talked about the environment, that's more abstract. Are there other games that you've done where the decision that they make is more closely related to ones that they might make in the immediate sense?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think a lot of the time when I've designed games, it's not that I'm trying to get you to connect the decisions you make in the game to the decisions you make in real life. I think it's almost more that the decisions you make in the game, I'm trying to get you to explore a system. Because in, for example, the climate game, you're playing as council members. Now, I don't expect most of these kids to go off and be council members. The decisions you're making here are, which suburb do we deploy this education program in? How do we spend our money on research or infrastructure? Those aren't really decisions I want kids to be making, but it's more like I want them to be aware of a system. I want them to understand sort of this system so that they can understand sort of broadly, how they might act later, or even just so they can be more informed when they vote or things like that. Maybe some of those decisions are a bit connected. But yeah, no, it's a very good point. A lot of people design games kind of like okay, an environmental game. I'm not sure it's the best example, but they say, okay, you've got to choose, do you recycle or do you just throw it on the ground? If you recycle, you get a little reward. If you throw it on the ground, you lose points. I don't really care for that. I don't think that they're trying to use like a reward, conditioning method. I don't know if that is effective because you're not teaching a system. You're trying to mark a checkbox, and people know what they should do. The interesting thing is what they actually will do or what they're incentivized to do. Yeah, I've rambled off a bit there. Mm, 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 mm,
what you do when you play sport is you have a scheme.
mm,
So if you want people to generalize stuff, you actually have to simultaneously teach them, like hypothetically, good decisions to make, but also a decision schema on which they operate. That's what that game is, I think.
You're getting them to weigh up different things, yeah.
In addition to a kind of local, I need to make this decision at this point because it's a good decision to make. That's why it's kind of hard.
Yeah, definitely. And in terms of the application, like the impacts of that, it's the same issue as with the impacts of education. It's the constant. We've just had a group of kids come in to learn about, renewable energy. What impact is that going to have? What impact do we want it to have? How can we measure it? I measure the effectiveness of most of my programs in the discussion I have with the kids at the end, how much I feel like they've absorbed or engaged with it, but I don't know what they do, in a year from now or a week from now. Have they had those good discussions with their parents? Yeah, it's very hard to tell. Thank you. Good question.
Amazing. Thank you.
Thank you.